All right. Welcome to AI Goes Deep. This is the show where deep tech venturing meets applied AI from the people that's building it. My name is Xiao, and I'm the VP of Venture Building here at FedTech. In each episode, we look at one aspect of how AI is changing deep tech venture building. Our mission here is to separate what's real from what's a press release. So this is our first episode. I think it's appropriate that we start with the advanced materials. Well, the reason for that, other than my personal background, it's an interest that it's in materials, is that in 2011, the U.S. government launched something called the Materials Genome Initiative, or MGI. The MGI's goal was very clear. It takes too long to develop new materials. Let's cut that time in half. Why don't we use data, computing power, collaboration across agencies to do so, right? So this is not just a single research grant, it's an infrastructure play. There is shared data, there's shared computation, and there's shared standards across agencies, including NIST, EOE, and other agencies as well. So that's why I'm honored to have Dr. James Warren as my first guest. So Jim is a physicist at NIST, where he has been there since 1992, and he is directed the Materials Genome Program since 2012. He also co-founded and directs the NIST Center for Theoretical and Computational Material Science. His PhD is in statistical physics from UC Santa Barbara under Jim Langer. Earlier this year, Jim published an article titled Overcoming Roadblocks for Implementing AI and Machine Learning Methods for Materials Management. In other words, we got a lot of things to talk about today. Thanks for joining us, Jim.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, Jim, so it's now 2026, and it has been 15 years since the MGI program started. My first question is, what has changed during that time, and what are some of the roadblocks, let's say, or challenges, and some of the progress that you want to highlight?
Well, certainly when we kicked off the MGI, that was itself built on many decades of prior art and concepts that had been around for a very, very long time in material science and engineering around, how do we essentially use modeling to predict materials with enough fidelity that we can impact their insertion into manufactured products at an accelerated rate. And so the MGI, in some sense, is the, putting the federal stamp on those ideas in 2011 to say, okay, let's make a significant investment here now. The technology has evolved to a point where we can make a significant substantive difference in the rate at which materials are now developed. And so it was very exciting to be involved, when the government decides to make such an investment. And as you pointed out, a number of agencies then sort of stepped up to the plate there to be part of the initiative, in particular NIST, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and DOD were the biggest players. NASA, at the time, the Food and Drug Administration was involved for a while. Anyway, a large number of agencies have been involved, remain involved, over the years, I would say that, sort of what really defined the MGI is each agency sort of brought its own suite of capacities and mission to the MGI, was really about that computation being elevated to a peer with experiment, but also from this point of view, the introduction of data as a sort of element in its own right that we were going to think pretty hard about. And of course, and I assume we'll dig into this some more in the discussion, but that's really what I would say was a significant change in perspective, perhaps, from prior efforts in thinking about the sort of materials acceleration problem. And of course, this anticipated only by a few years the explosion in AI and artificial intelligence methods to really accelerate the discovery, design, deployment of new materials into manufactured products. And in what we've seen in the last couple of years, I'd say, but perhaps the last decade, if we want to be generous, is that those types of capabilities have finally allowed us to start imagining that we're going to realize the full dream of the MGI of moving all the way from the lowest basic research technology readiness levels in materials design all the way out to full deployment, with the knowledge of the basic research sort of baked in to the materials discovery, development and deployment process.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me unpack that a bit for the non-technical folks that's listening. When we talk about materials, there are really two stages. First, discovery. Say you're making a polymer, and at its core, that's a selection problem. Which monomers, which additives, and under which conditions do you make this polymer, right? Combining all the things together. So get that combination right, you have discovered something new. Then comes the harder part, making it at scale. So let's say you found the pathway and you prove that in the lab, but now you have to produce that in volume. That's where technology readiness level comes in. The TRL climbs as you move along that path. And when people, talk about AI and machine learning in the space here, I think of it as sort of a few buckets. There's the data itself, R&D data. There's published literature. There's wet lab data, things you do in the lab, on the bench. There's also simulated data from, let's say, high throughput computation, and then AI runs through all of it. So, two questions for you, Jim. First, does that framework match how you see it? And also, if it does, looking back at 15 years of the MGI program, what have we gotten right and what caught us sort of off guard?
Okay, so there was a lot in what you just said. So allow me to recapitulate a little bit in my own words, and then we can sort of dig into it a little bit more. So, right. So I would say, certainly what you just described, as you said, for the non-expert in materials, I would even boil it down simpler. I would say that material science is in direct analogy, and it's not even an analogy to cooking. Cooking is just an example of material science with something we're all quite familiar with. And to cook anything, you need more than just the ingredients, right? You need the recipe. And so to make something involves a deep knowledge about both. And if you want to do design, in some sense, you want to say, I'm looking here at this, beautiful dish that you've prepared for me. Can I actually figure out, using my knowledge, how you did it? If I can do that, I can reverse engineer and I can create alternative dishes and foods, because I will have developed enough understanding, essentially, of cooking that I can do that. So it's instead of having to spend 2 years at Cordon Bleu, right? Essentially, you can encode your knowledge about how to make things and accelerate your ability to do that. So that's sort of all that we're trying to do. But of course, it's highly non-trivial, right? Because you're trying to work your way up from basic knowledge about the atoms in a system all the way out, as you said, to deployment. So the MGI is trying to realize that by this hierarchy of various kinds of models of systems and computation. And then you said you could start to then say, well, if I had the ability to do data-driven, what would that look like? Right. So, of course, the only two real sources for data are experiment and computation. And you could say, well, there's a third one in the literature, but hopefully the literature is just restating what came from computations and or experiments. Now, when you say data from a computation, that's rather a different beast, right, than experiments. In some sense, experiments, of course, they have to be done well. Are true, what we would call ground truths. They are, all of the models are, in a sense, try to predict experiments. And if they don't do that, we consider them to be not very good models, right? Understanding why they fail may be very interesting. So, I want to make sure that I do make that distinction. Now, we do have models that we have a great deal of faith in a large number of circumstances. We know really when can be applied. And, so for example, quantum mechanics, you can certainly write down the equations describing such systems. You may or may not be able to solve them. And certainly if you want to predict, billions of atoms or trillions of atoms or something even more macroscopic, you're doomed if you want to solve those equations exactly. So that's the challenge. And so, of course, there are a number of ways then that AI can come into the game there. So, usually I say the reasons to use AI are when you don't have a model. And so instead you take data and essentially the AI makes a model for you. Or if you already do have a model, you might want it to run a lot faster. And then AI can really help you out there and sometimes give you, a million times faster or something like that model. And this may allow you to take the knowledge that you've generated at very small timescales and, your materials discovery process and really allow it to operate in a manufacturing environment. Which is a very exciting prospect, as I said. And this is really what I was talking about when I talk about inserting materials knowledge into this higher technology readiness level stream. And so that's sort of what I've been thinking about through the course of the MGI. And if you look at the history of the MGI, I think you will see that while there was a lot of ambition in the original documents, our ability to really see the impact going beyond, say, TRL3 was rather limited. And so now I think what you're finally seeing is that we are at the cusp of really, truly making an enormous impact all the way through to deployment.
So one of the angles I have been tracking in materials informatics is the companies themselves. And it feels like we're on sort of the second generation now, or third, depending on how you count it. Since large language models arrived a few years ago, VCs are pouring money into, names like Lila Science, and then the more sort of materials focused ones like Periodic Labs, Radical AI, Cusp AI, and so on. But, we also have had companies in the space for years, right? Citrine Informatics, Cobotics, and Countable, and so on. So what is the difference between those two groups? Are they actually doing different things or the same thing with better tools? And why now? Why the sudden flood of money into the new ones?
Sure. So I think I would break that into the two pieces that you said, which is sort of, Citrine, I remember talking to the founders way back at the beginning of Materials Genome Initiative. It was sort of the first MGI inspired company, for lack of a better word. And then you listed a few more that are sort of old school materials informatics sort of approaches. Old school. It's kind of funny to me because, again, they were coming at this from a materials informatics data-driven approach, but obviously the methods were not as sophisticated at that time. But nonetheless, these companies were reasonably successful. They're still around, and have evolved their business models with the changing landscape of the capabilities of these models. So I'm sure that if you went and talked to them now, they would claim to be using the most state-of-the-art methods as well. So I certainly don't want to in any way shortchange them. But what has changed, if you look at the more recent, verily well-endowed with startup money companies like Lila Periodic, for example, and others, is that you're seeing that billions of dollars now being put into there because it's one thing to be able, to compute, and certainly a big piece of the MGI was saying, here we can make some really, really powerful predictions about systems and accelerate the design and deployment of materials. It's another thing to have a feedback loop between experiment and computation in almost real time, right? So a self-driving lab is really what these companies are about, and something that certainly here at NIST, we've been talking around a very, very long time, since, around 2017, quite publicly. There are a number of other people around government, and of course, I don't want to diminish a lot of the work that was going on, particularly in academia, around these concepts, around autonomous laboratories. but the notion of closed loop or semi-autonomous, if you want a human in the loop, accelerated materials design is really realizing the vision of the Materials Genome Initiative, which is this tight coupling between computation and experiment. But now the coupling is explicit. And so you're building a laboratory that has machine intelligence in a large number of the steps in the process, from the synthesis of the material to rapid characterization of what you've managed to synthesize, and then AI decision algorithms to decide what experiment to do next, and then hand it back to synthesis, and off you go around for the next loop as you sort of evolve the system towards the desired material. But I'd also like to add one more point there, which is that in addition to sort of zooming in on your optimized material, the thing that excites me perhaps even more about these systems is that the self-driving lab is itself a data engine that is building a comprehensive model of the materials processing, right? That ingredients and recipe we were talking about before, so that you now have the ability to generate this surrogate model of the material and its process. And that is enormously valuable for your next round of sort of synthesis project or whatever comes in. If somebody brings in something relatively close to what you've already learned about, you're able to get up and running very quickly and could, in principle, design a material in perhaps weeks where it could have taken years before. So the potential is enormous.
Okay, another question. What are you seeing on the corporate side? When I looked at this, the big companies were pretty conservative about adopting AI, especially from an outside vendor. Has that changed now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in that question. So let me see if I can walk through that. So first of all, I want to make sure that I'm clear that while, yes, the risks are significantly lower when you're talking about a materials application than you would be when you're introducing something into a human. They're not zero. There are areas where there are reasons to be concerned. And so I don't want to sound too glib about that. But we don't have to dig into every case. But, it's certainly for a lot of biological examples, it's obvious why you would want the FDA involved, for example. But, from the point of view of a design of material thing, if you want to think about a drug as just a material, then that's just another constraint, right? So if you're designing, you have to design it for biocompatibility, human compatibility. That's something you have to consider. And that may be a hard constraint that you'll have to consider. Okay. So putting all of that aside, and if you say, okay, so now let's look at a more traditional manufacturer, and you're sort of asking the question, I think, around adoption of these new techniques. And I think this is very similar to the same set of questions that we had back in the early days of the MGI and before that, around whether or not companies were using best practice in the application of modeling techniques to improve their bottom line, to get a better return on investment than they were currently getting. And so the question would be, if they adopt MGI approaches, or a popular one more in the metallurgy crowd was integrated computational materials engineering, which is a predecessor of MGI concepts. There are reports showing you can get a 7-to-1 ROI, right? If you use those techniques, right? So why didn't they all immediately run and do that with a few outliers? And I think the answers are manifold. I mean, there's, part of the problem is that you can still talk about a high return on investment, but the investment itself may be very large. So that would be a high risk then if you don't get it implemented correctly. In general, companies don't like deviating from their existing manufacturing processes if they're already making money, right? That's just another kind of risk. And I think in general, companies are risk averse. What we're talking about in terms of the exciting new developments are startups. They're defined by high risk, high reward kinds of plays. So the fact that you're seeing investment in the startup space tells you something about where we are in the technology maturity, right? Which is that it's clearly viewed as very promising, right? That's why you're seeing such large investments, but you're also not seeing instantaneous adoption across swaths of industry, because if that was happening, then you would need the startups, right? So it's, in some sense, what you're seeing is capitalism sorting out what the risk profile kind of looks like right now for these approaches. And, as these things get a little bit more mature, I think you will start to see uptick. Whether we have to go through a full Gartner hype cycle on this stuff or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that in some sense, this is inevitable. Okay. Right. So the way I would think about it is simple. If you ask companies whether they would want to automate, so just figuring out ways to put machines in place, robots or whatever you want to call them, in place in various places to help accelerate and increase the reproducibility of what they do, they would almost all say yes, right? Because this is just a simple way to save money and increase efficiency. So that's sort of a gimme. But then the next question around autonomy, right? How do you put machines in place essentially to do repeat things in a regular way? But not only that, but also to sort of implement the research and discovery process through the addition of artificial intelligence. So sort of moving the role of people in that process to different points than they traditionally are right now, to more setting the goals for these systems and sort of circumscribing what it is that you think are the irrelevant optimizations and hypotheses that need to be explored. That involves a very dramatic change in a lot of companies around how they get their R&D done if they're doing R&D. And there, you've got a lot of experts. They have ways that they have been successful so far. And they're going to be very conservative about replacing a lot of those things with new approaches. So what I think you will see is a couple of different models for how it gets you get the uptake, right? One of them will be subcontracts, right, to these startups or to some other companies who can do that work for them. Another one will be, of course, the adoption quickly of automation where they can get it, followed by point insertion of algorithms where it seems appropriate and they're comfortable, with the safety and reliability of those processes. Or you'll see pilot efforts, right, which would be pretty standard, right? Ultimately, you want to think about these things in a full systems level, right? You should be designing your whole operation with these types of approaches involved. And you should essentially have digital twins of the entire manufacturing process, from the model of the factory all the way down to the processing of material at the most basic level.
So if I'm a startup founder in the space, how do I actually work with the MGI? I know it's an interagency initiative here, but where is the door for us to come in and work with you?
So that's an interesting question. So the MGI, right, is this amalgam of a bunch of different agencies that are basically talking to each other to talk about where the investments are being made within government in these spaces. So if you really want to work with the MGI, that's sort of a kind of a foggy kind of a thing. So, but of course, one thing is to reach out to me and see whether or not I can put you in contact with the portfolio across government. If you look at where the investments in the U.S. government currently are and where the likely points of contact are going to be in terms of investments that are being made, a lot of them now, of course, are going to be reflected in the DOE's and now cross government's Genesis mission. Which, if you look at their portfolio, has a lot of pedigree that can trace its roots to the MGI. And also say, if you take a look at the National Science Foundation's most recent investments in support of the Genesis mission. Right. That's right. The programmable cloud labs. So this really grew out of conversations that the MGI started, a number of years ago. And this administration really decided to make a significant investment in the space. I'm delighted to see that. And a large fraction of the investments in the programmable cloud labs are, in fact, directly materials based. And some of the other ones are bio, as we were discussing before. So you're seeing a really nice spectrum of investments across materials classes and application spaces. So I think a lot of companies are going to be very interested to see how those evolve and look for points of contact where they can, demonstrate or test out a lot of their, fantasies about how they might take advantage of these approaches and bring them under their own roof.
That's great. So with Genesis, there's funding on the table. And then the programmable cloud labs you mentioned, 20 centers, $20 million each, $400 million total. That's a lot of money. So to me, that means self-driving lab is really on demand. You can go test with a facility, someone else is building it. So I'm genuinely glad to see that investment happening. Which brings me to the other thing I wanted to ask about. The article you mentioned at the top of the episode, right? Tell us more about it.
Sure. So, the first thing I'd say about that article is that I was delighted to have a number of extremely bright and clever co-authors on that article. And so, I helped bring it together. But depending on the aspect of the article, you're going to find that I'm going to point you towards different technical experts. But from my own perspective, on the work that we presented there, we were really trying to look at the application of AI in general to the materials development process. And we used self-driving labs as the sort of lens to think about the application of AI. But it doesn't have to be an SDL for it to still, AI is used in all of these different aspects of the materials design process. And in fact, an SDL is just a recapitulation of the way that science is done. You're just trying to do it with as much machine control as possible. And so within that framework, we then broke down the R&D process for materials, right, into as many of its constituent parts as we could, and showed how an SDL then works and attacks these problems, including agentified types of workflows and how decisions get made. And so all we were doing there was showing essentially where all of the places are that you can bring to bear the various compute-related tools to accelerate materials design, to get you to a design material, excuse me. So, we could just, you could go through all of the nominal quote unquote roadblocks, but they are essentially the roadblocks that are in general exist for applying AI to materials discovery.
Okay, so we talked about the title yesterday, and I really do love it. I recognized a few of the co-authors too, and I think I have spoken with a couple of them. This is the end of this episode, Jim. This is really great. If this episode was helpful for our listeners, please follow us wherever you're listening, and also send it to the person that you think can argue with us about it. Always happy to chat with them as well. Again, this is the first episode of AI Goes Deep with Dr. Jim Warren. Jim, thank you again for doing this with me.
My pleasure. Have a great one.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.